Hey folks, Chad Perkins for Red Giant, and in this very fun little tutorial here, we're going to look at how to use custom particles with Form. Now we're going to start by looking at the loads of free custom particles that are just built right into Form, making this process extremely easy. I'm also going to explain the 6 types of custom particles, and then we're going to look at using rotation layer maps with custom particles. In the last tutorial we covered layer maps, and I kind of skipped over the rotation layer maps because it didn't make as much sense without the custom particles, so we'll cover that here. Now, you can get to the custom particles in the regular Form UI by opening up the particles section and changing the particle type in this dropdown. I find this to be a lot better of an experience doing it in the designer. So I'm going to click the designer button, and here is the designer. And I'm going to go to particle type in the particle section. And then in the upper right-hand section here of the controls area, we can change the type to one of these 6 options, one of the 3 sprite options or one of the 3 textured polygon options, and I'll explain the difference between those momentarily. For now, I'm just going to choose sprite. Now, your particles will oftentimes disappear instantly. That's totally fine because we haven't selected a layer yet to use. Now, if you actually want to use a different layer, then you're going to need to go back to the regular Form UI. But here is this awesome Choose Sprite button, which will open up this collection of amazing sprites included with Form. And you can see all these amazing categories here. And, you know, to be honest with you, I knew about this custom particles business for a long time using Form, but I'm too lazy, I guess. I don't know. It just feels like a lot of work to get an extra particle, a custom particle ready. So I usually just try to use Form settings to kind of get where I need to go. But now that there's this huge library of amazing, smoke and fire and holiday objects, there's bokeh and these cool flat 2D shapes. There's just so many options here that it's just built into Form, and it's really easy to get Form to be very versatile because it's just built into the interface. Later on in this tutorial, I'll show you how to make your own custom particles from scratch. But for now, let's just stick to these awesome ones that come with Form. I'm going to scroll down towards the bottom, past all these amazing things. And I'm going to go to the water and snow section. I'm going to go ahead and click on Cloud 3 and then click OK. Now, this is often the result that you get when you first load up a custom particle. It's not super impressive. You kind of can't tell what's going on. It's just a slight variation of the default settings. And what we need to do is change our base form. And especially with clouds, I want to create like a cloudy scene here. And this grid that we have set up is just not going to do it. So I'm going to go to the type, the base form over here. And I'm going to go back to my controls area and fiddle with the settings. I'm going to change the size to XYZ individual. And then I'm going to bump up the X quite a bit, maybe like 1500 or so. And then I'm going to take down Y, because I don't need them that tall. Take it down quite a bit, maybe 20 or 30, somewhere around there. And then I also want to increase the size Z, but I don't want that many particles in Z. I just want 2. So I'm going to change this to 2. And actually, I don't want this many clouds. Every single one of those dots, every single one of those points is a separate cloud. I don't want that. So I'm going to take this way, way down, which I tend to do when I'm using custom particles, just way, way, way less particles. Let's say 8 in X, and our 9 is fine. And then I'll take this down to 2 in Y. And so now we just have a few of these clouds. So what I'm going to do is go over to size rotation, and I'm going to increase the size a lot, like 250 or something. And let's also bump up the size random a little bit. And by a little bit, I mean quite a bit, maybe 70 or so. So now we're getting some versatility in the size and shapes of our clouds here. Well, not the shapes, but the sizes of our clouds. And it's starting to look more like a believable cloudy scene. But we're not done yet. Let's go over to the opacity block here and increase the opacity random just a smidge. And actually a little bit more than that will work. Maybe that looks good. About 20, 30, somewhere in there. Now, here's a cool trick. I want to turn on the fractal field. I want fractal displacement. But as I increase the displace value, let's say we increase this a lot so that we get a lot of diversity in the movement. Well, as soon as I start doing that, up to 250, then my clouds are bouncing around. And it looks pretty cool. And it's pleasant to watch and kind of delightful, frankly. But this is not what I want for my clouds, as adorable as it is. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take down flow evolution. And watch this. I'm going to take this down. If I take it down to 0, it's just not going to move, but it's still going to be displaced, which is great. But I want a little bit of movement. So I'm going to take this to just 2. Just 2. And now we have this slow moving clouds, like they're just kind of in the breeze. We could take this, down a little bit more to 1, or we could bump this up a little bit more, but I really like that. I'm going to go ahead and click the camera icon and rotate this around until I get a layout that I like. There we go. That's looking pretty awesome. Again, the clouds are moving, drifting slowly. We have a pretty believable scene, and we just started with this grid of particles. Because of custom particles, we could create scenes like this, which is awesome. And, if I push the C key on my keyboard, we can go through the camera tools. So we could, if this were back in After Effects, we were to accept this, we could pan the camera, we could track the camera, we could push in to these clouds. And because we have a little depth in the Z-axis, we get this parallax effect and we get some really great clouds. We could enhance this by changing the settings, but still, as it is, this is pretty fun stuff, guys. Pretty fun stuff. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to the particle type here, and I want to talk about these options right here. I'm going to go to this drop down, and again, we have 3 sprite options: Sprite, Sprite Colorize, and Sprite Fill, and 3 textured polygon options: textured polygon, colorize, and fill as well. Let's talk about that. Bring up the graphics. Okay, so let's talk about sprites versus textured polygons. Now, sprites are flat 2D objects that always face the camera. That's the real difference. The big important difference is that sprites always face the camera. So if you had something like these clouds, you'd probably want them to be constantly face the camera, because we would expect that those things would be 3D. We expect those clouds to be 3D. So typically, again, if you have spheres or if you have 3D objects as custom particles, we would expect them to be 3-dimensional, and of course they're actually just flat. So if we don't want to see the side of them, then sprite's your option, because again, sprites always face the camera. Textured polygons are allowed to move in 3D space and don't always face the camera. So if you had something like dollar bills or postcards or maybe leaves even, that were these flat objects that wanted to like tumble in 3D space, then textured polygons might be a better solution there. Now, for each class, if you will, for each setting for either sprite or textured polygon, there are 3 options. There are regular, colorize, and fill. And regular just means use the color of the object, use just the inherent color of the custom particle. When you choose colorize, it will tint that object that color. In other words, if we go, like, let's say here to the particle section, and I change this color to, anything else, let's say neon noir, for example, and I went back over to the particle type and I chose sprite colorize, it's going to tint these clouds with the colors from this gradient. Now, if I were to choose sprite fill, it wouldn't tint the object, it would completely fill the color of the object. Now, for single color objects like these clouds, that might not be super obvious, but if I go back into the sprites, and you can see stuff like these fire explosions, if you were to colorize them and tint them, it would still have all this detail. If you were to fill them, you would lose all this detail and it would just be one solid flat color, like paint almost. So those are the 2 categories: sprite and textured polygon, and the 3 coloring options: just regular color from the object, colorize, and fill. Now I'm actually going to go ahead and cancel out of everything that I'm doing here and get back to the regular form UI. Again, the particle type dropdowns right here, we can choose sprite or textured polygon. And once we choose one of those, we can click choose sprite here. And then to choose another layer, we choose the texture dropdown, which we're actually going to look at right now. I'm going to go to a different composition. And in this composition, I've created a little custom particle, a little shape layer here, just a little polygon. Little tiny little comp there. It's a little polygon that draws on and pops away. That's all. Now this is very tiny. This is at 200% even, so this is actually the original size. And we do recommend that when you create custom particles that you do so maybe in a smaller composition so that you can have a very small layer there. So this is just 100 by 100, and that's generally the recommended setting. You could go higher than that, but it does start to slow things down because remember, this is just one single particle. So I'm going to go back to my particle composition for here, and I'm going to turn off the visibility and turn on the visibility of my form layer. Again, this is just a standard form layer. And I'll do this here in the regular form UI so you can see how this is done. I'm going to go to particle type, and I'm going to change this to sprite. And then I'm going to go open up the texture section. And in this layer drop down, I'm going to choose my pre-comp here. And it does take a little bit to load because keep in mind, every single one of these particles is that animation. So I'm going to go up to base form, and I'm going to change this to XYZ individual. And I'm going to take particles in Z to just 1. And we'll maybe take this down to like 15 and 15. So just way, way smaller of a base form. And then I could go down to the particle section and increase the size quite a bit and get some of those particles back. And this is great. Even I haven't done really anything to it, but it automatically staggers the animations. So we create these really interesting rippling effects. I love that. Now you might not want that to be the case. And so you can actually go over here to time sampling in the texture section and choose from these different options. Now keep in mind, these are only for when you're using animations as, or a sequence, for example, as a texture. If you're just having one flat still image that doesn't move, you're not going to really get anything out of these options. But if I change this to current time, then these objects will grow together. And that's a pretty interesting look. And actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to drop these particles down to maybe 10 and 10 and bring up the size and the size of the particles a little bit, just so we have a little bit more space to see what's going on there. And maybe even less in Y, maybe 8 in Y. There we go. So sampling the current time makes it so that it unifies the whole experience. The animation, everything animates all at the same time. If we say random loop, then it's going to randomize where each particle is in its cycle, and that creates a lot of random movement here. You see that our original polygon wasn't super exciting, but it's definitely got a lot of energy and action to it as we use this random loop option. And of course, we could change the random seed if we don't like that particular version that it's sending us out. And again, keep in mind, we have all the options for form. You know, we could randomize the size if we wanted to. A lot of power here. Also, be aware in the rotation section, we can play with these rotation options. We can increase random rotation and just kind of give each one of these particles its own random rotation value. Now, earlier I talked about the difference between sprite and textured polygons. And let's see the difference in this example here. I'm going to actually change the base form to sphere. And so we have a sphere, and then I'll maybe bump up these particles a little bit more. And I'm going to go ahead and make these values all equal. So we have an equal sphere here. There we go. And I'm going to go ahead and create a new comp camera. Now, when I click on the unified camera tool and move around, these are sprites. So you see that we can't see the side of them. We can't see behind them. They're always pointing towards the camera. Now, if I go back to form and I change this from sprite to textured polygon, then as we move this around, we can see the side of them. So they are allowed to exist somewhere in 3D space. Notice by changing this to textured polygon, we also unlock a lot more rotation options because these are allowed to rotate on all of the axes. This is also a good place to experiment with the Colorize and Fill option. So we're seeing the color from the original shape layer I created. If I choose textured polygon colorize, it's going to tint this with the color in the particle section. Let's just say that it's going to be red. And so we're still seeing some of the gradient here because we're just tinting it. We're still seeing some of that gradient that's from the original shape. But if I were to change this from colorize to fill, it's no longer respecting the gradient that was on the object. It's just filling the alpha channel with a solid color. Now, one more quick example here. Let's look at rotation layer maps. I have here a gradient. Again, this is just a shape layer. I'm gonna get back to my selection tool here. Just a simple black to white gradient. I'm gonna turn it off for the time being. I'm gonna go to form, and I'm going to go to the particle type. I'm gonna choose sprite, and I'm going to click choose sprite here, show you that we can load up the same sprites as we did in the designer. I just find it to be a little bit easier in the designer. And I'm gonna go ahead and click on this thin arrow tall, and I'm going to go ahead and click OK. Give that a second to load up. And again, let's just adjust our base form here. I'm going to change this to XYZ individual. I'm going to take the particles in Z down to just 1 and the particles in X and Y down to like 15. I'll probably change that in a second. And I can't even see what I'm doing. So what I'm going to do is go down to the particle section and bump up the particle size. There we go. And there's our arrows there. And now I can increase the size X and the size Y as needed. I'm also going to take down the number of particles in Y. There we go. Actually, let me make those arrows just a little bit bigger so you can see them a little bit more clearly. Now they're all pointing up. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to close up base form, close up particle, and I'm going to open up the layer map section and open up the rotate area in the layer maps section. And I want to use this shape layer 1 layer, which I now realize I named poorly, or I didn't name. I'm going to change the layer for Z to shape layer 1. Now again, as we learned in the last tutorial in this series, nothing happens until you change map over to X, Y, and now we can see. The black area, again, turn on the gradient for just a second. The arrows in the black area are pointing up. The arrows where the area is white, the gradient is white, are pointing down. And in the in-between areas are kind of rotating from up to down. So if we were to go into the gradient fill of the shape layer and fiddle with the gradient, you can see that we can control the rotation of the arrows. So we really have tons of control over not only our particles, but what they look like and also how they behave. So even though layer maps are not really related to custom particles, because layer maps refer to the behavior of particles, custom particles refer to what the particles actually look like, so they're not really related. But using those two really powerful concepts together, you really can make form particles do whatever you need them to. Thanks so much for watching, folks. Have a great day, and we'll see you in the next one. Shout out to Pond5 for all the super dope music I used in this tutorial.